so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, and welcome to this Morpheus Tech Brief on getting started with the Morpheus REST API. I'm Martez Reed, Director of Technical Marketing with Morpheus Data. Let's go ahead and jump into the content. So I imagine many of us are familiar with REST APIs or RESTful APIs in terms of how they work. In the case of the Morpheus platform, very similar to other systems, it is utilized and leveraged to be able to facilitate a programmatic interaction with the Morpheus platform. So whether that be a script or via the Morpheus CLI or many of the other capabilities to interact with REST APIs, whether it be Postman, those can be leveraged to interact with the Morpheus platform to perform various operations, whether that be provisioning operations such as requesting an instance or management operations such as configuring a group or creating a cloud within the Morpheus platform. And when we talk about higher level use cases, there are various areas in which the Morpheus platform can be integrated into a larger IT environment to be able to take advantage or benefit from the functionality that the Morpheus platform provides. And so I've outlined a number of use cases here, certainly not all inclusive of every potential use case, but certainly a number of the use cases that we regularly see. The first one is CI/CD integration. So many organizations that develop software will leverage what are known as CI/CD pipelines, or continuous integration, continuous delivery, or continuous deployment pipelines, utilizing platforms such as GitLab or Jenkins, Azure DevOps, various others to facilitate the automated testing and potentially deployment of software into their environment. So as an example, oftentimes when an application is being developed, there's a need for acceptance testing to actually stand up an environment that mirrors what production will look like to run essentially the application through its paces, to test the database configuration, to test the application deployment, to test how the UI looks from a application perspective. The Morpheus platform, leveraging the REST API, can be integrated into that process to facilitate the provisioning of environments on demand, whether it be a QA or testing environment, to stand up an entire application stack to be able to perform that testing. So in the case of the CI/CD pipelines, a platform like GitLab or Jenkins or Azure DevOps can reach out to the Morpheus platform via its REST API, request that a new environment be spun up, pull back information regarding that environment to perform additional testing against that particular environment that's been stood up. Once that testing has passed or performed its various operations, that platform can then reach back out to the Morpheus platform to be able to tear down that environment. So interacting with the REST API to be able to facilitate that on-demand testing for a given application deployment. Platform integration is another common one that we see. Various different platforms can be utilized to interact with the Morpheus platform. So a number that pop up pretty frequently: ServiceNow, custom portals. Certainly one that we're seeing more and more of is a platform known as Backstage. So being able to utilize those platforms as the front-facing or the system that users interact with from a UI or UX perspective, but leveraging Morpheus platform essentially underneath the covers to facilitate various operations such as provisioning or execution of automation to be able to drive that particular operation forward. So oftentimes we talk about Morpheus, whether it's the front door or it's not the front door. In this case, the front door is another system like a Backstage, a ServiceNow, or a custom portal that we often see to be able to front the Morpheus platform, but that front system will interact with the Morpheus platform via its REST API. Automated platform deployment is another one. Many organizations have gone down the path of trying to automate as much as possible in terms of configuration as well as system stand-up. So oftentimes tools like infrastructure as code tools are utilized to be able to spin up infrastructure and then be able to configure those systems essentially from soup to nuts to where you essentially click the button and away it goes, completing the full end-to-end process of standing up that system. And so as part of this, being able to leverage the Morpheus platform's REST API to facilitate the automated configuration of Morpheus. So that could be things like installing the license, configuring tenants, configuring policies, all those various management operations from Morpheus standpoint, and doing them from a automated REST API perspective. Similar to the automated platform deployment, platform configuration. So in this case, it would be Morpheus is already stood up. It's more of a long-lived running instance of Morpheus, but I really want to leverage the REST API for configuration of the Morpheus platform to be able to ensure either configuration as code or just simply consistency. Certainly a number of tools in this space that can be leveraged. Ansible is a pretty popular one. Terraform, Morpheus does have a Terraform provider that can be utilized to facilitate the configuration of the platform, Python, as well as the Morpheus CLI, which actually interacts with the REST API to facilitate its operations. So as I said, a number of different use cases that we commonly see, certainly not completely exhaustive of every possible use case. So now that we walk through a number of the reasons and ways in which the platform, the REST API is being utilized, let's delve deeper into the REST API itself. So the Morpheus platform has a REST API. So documentation for the REST API, there's a number of endpoints to be able to interact with the system. Documentation regarding that can be found at apidocs.morpheusdata.com. So the documentation includes a number of things that are extremely helpful that I find particularly valuable. So when we go to apidocs.morpheusdata.com, there are the various endpoints that are listed. There's also the ability to be able to view the various parameters that the endpoint will accept. And then one of the things that is particularly interesting is the ability to be able to select from various different languages, as we see on this particular screenshot on the right side. So whether it's Shell or PowerShell or Python or JavaScript, certainly it may not align with your coding process or the way in which you code. But one of the things I found is that it's extremely helpful to give me the essentially starting point of how I might want to craft my code, as well as in particular is how to craft various JSON payloads. It's one of the things I found to be particularly helpful in that some of the payloads can get pretty complex and include a number of different options. So that's definitely one of those great things to be able to perform essentially a sanity check to see, okay, have I formatted or configured this particular payload appropriately? So take a look at the documentation. And so one of the first things to talk about with REST APIs is authentication. So the Morpheus platform includes various different ways to authenticate from a REST API perspective. And so the first one is username and password. We'll walk through that, which will actually generate a token. So particularly tokens are valuable for scenarios where you have, as an example, single sign-on configured for the Morpheus platform. In essence, there is no username or password per se, so you authenticate against the REST API. So you'll need a token to facilitate that operation. And so what you'll do is you come into the Morpheus platform and you'll click on your user profile, and then you'll be presented with an option to generate an API access token. One of the things that we see here is that there are a number of client IDs that are available for us to generate tokens. A number of these are for specific purposes. So the one that's most commonly utilized for API access is Morph, or MORPH-API, to generate that token. And by default, the token is valid for the equivalent of 1 calendar year. So we'll take a look at tokens and that process as well. All right, so somebody asked the question of how many hours is the token, API token alive? So by default, when you generate a token, it is that 1 calendar year. We'll take a look in a second on ways that we can change that in recent versions of the Morpheus platform. So we also got another question. Do we have a public Swagger to access the APIs and the payload? So for those that are not familiar, a common format for configuration or representation from an API perspective are Swagger docs. Often they are built into the given platform to be able to natively facilitate operations against that system via the REST API. And so at the moment, there is no Swagger API endpoint or a page for the Morpheus platform to directly facilitate those operations. So from that standpoint, it's going to be the API documentation that will be leveraged or utilized that does accept some inputs. Certainly, I wouldn't input any specific tokens that are actually valid in your environment or the URL. But one of the things we can take a look at is how that can be leveraged to generate the particular payload as part of that process. Another method to interact with the API that I found particularly helpful is the Morpheus CLI, which, as I said, interacts with the REST API. There are a number of flags that can be utilized or leveraged to output various information, such as dry runs with JSON output that I find particularly helpful. So there's a -D and a -J flag when you run a particular operation. So what that will do is that will prompt you for the various inputs to provide information for, let's say, creating a cloud or an instance or various different types of objects in the Morpheus platform. At which point you'll then be able to generate what the input payload for that API call should be in a dry run in which it does not actually create the resource, but simply spits out the JSON payload. All right, so you got another question. Can you create custom client IDs? I'll actually get to that in 1 second. There's another question of how to report errors, discrepancies with the API docs. Notice that there are some issues with various endpoints. The API documentation, I believe, is publicly available. I will grab the link in a second, and you can submit GitHub issues to the Open API documentation as a means to be able to report any issues or discrepancies with the REST APIs. All right, so the question was, can you create custom client IDs? And so the answer is yes. In a recent version of the Morpheus platform, I believe it was around 5.3.3, in which we added support for custom OAuth clients. And so what that means is there's the ability to be able to do a couple of things. First is to be able to add custom client IDs in which you can specify information regarding that client ID, in particular things like the validity, duration, or interval of the token. So what that means is I might not want the duration of the token to be 1 year by default. I want it to be, let's say, 30 minutes or 6 weeks or whatever my desired duration or lifetime is. I can specify that during the creation of the custom client ID. And so what will happen is that new custom client ID will show up when a user then goes to generate a new token as part of what we saw on that previous page from the Morpheus platform. In addition to creating and modifying custom client IDs, there is also the ability to be able to modify the duration or lifetime of an existing client ID. As an example, from a security perspective, I might say that I don't want that Morph or MRPH-API token to be valid for 1 year. I only want it to be valid for a week or a month or whatever my desired configuration is from a security perspective or just a best practice organization perspective. I can tweak those to meet or align with my desired requirements. All right, so that walked through the ability to be able to create a custom client ID. All right, so now that we've walked through that, let's take a look at some, as an example, some code to be able to see how we might interact with the Morpheus platform. So let us jump over to some Visual Studio Code and start taking a look. But what we'll actually do is we'll jump back for a second to set the context. So looking at some REST API examples, we're going to walk through some basic to more advanced examples of interacting with the Morpheus platform and its REST API. So certainly one of the things we talked about in terms of getting started with the Morpheus platform is just authenticating to the Morpheus REST API. We talked about generating token. One of the other things we talked about was being able to leverage username and password as an example. So Morpheus platform does have a REST API endpoint for utilizing username and password credentials to generate a token outside of simply going into the Morpheus UI and generating that token. So it's the /OAuth/token API endpoint that we would utilize, and we would pass username and password as our credentials. So we're going to post to that API endpoint. It's going to return the appropriate information. And just for our testing purposes to validate that that token actually does work, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to interact with the /API/ping API endpoint, which simply pulls back basic information about the Morpheus system, such as the version of the Morpheus platform. So that will provide us a testing mechanism to ensure that we pulled back the access token appropriately as part of our request. So we're going to delve into a little bit of the code. This is in Python. Certainly it could be in Golang or any various different language. Less about the specifics of the actual language and more talking about how we interact with the Morpheus REST API and what that looks like. So let's minimize this. And let's take a look at our code. So there's a couple of things here in terms of the Python code. Certainly don't worry if you aren't really familiar with Python, but we're going to walk through the main highlights. So the URL, we're going to specify the Morpheus API endpoint. In this particular case, we have a function that is referred to as fetch token. And so we're passing it the URL as well as username and password, in this case for a service account, in order to fetch the access token from the payload. So let's take a quick look at the fetch token function. So one of the things we saw was that /OAuth token that we're going to append to our base URL, which was the https://grt morpheus01.grt.local. And I'm going to specify a number of query parameters. So these are documented in the REST API documentation for what should be specified for each of these various different options. So in this case, grant type, scope, client ID. Certainly things like the grant type and scope are static. One of the things I do want to point out is the client_ID. We looked at the various different clients in the Morpheus platform, certainly those native as well as those that are custom. If I decided I wanted to use a custom client, this is where I would specify to change that morph-API to the custom client ID that I specified. Number of headers that we specify as part of what needs to be passed to the payload in terms of that process. And then we see that we need to specify our actual credentials, username, password, and providing to the REST API. In this case, we're doing a post to the API endpoint. In my particular environment, I don't have a trusted cert, so I'm going verify false as an example, and then as well as passing the various other information. And then the Morpheus API will return the JSON payload, at which point I'm returning that as output of the function. So there's a question, is there a good reason for why you use a custom fetch token function instead of relying on a standard OAuth client library? Certainly you're open and available to do that. The reason I did was just from simplicity standpoint, just to simply leverage a REST API call. So you could certainly get more exotic and fancier from that standpoint. This was just literally keeping it as simple as possible. That was the sole reason. Great question. And so token payload is going to include that return response from the OAuth /token API endpoint, at which point I'll then do some print statements so that we can see what that looks like. And as part of that payload, there is an access token field. That's actually what I want to authenticate to the Morpheus API. That's actually what, when you go into the UI and you generate an API token, that's what it's showing. it's showing both the access token as well as a refresh token, which can be utilized to refresh the token as it reaches its expiration. So fetching that access token, storing that as token, and then utilizing that to interact with the Morpheus API for that ping operation. So as I said, the ping is just basically hitting the Morpheus API endpoint to pull back some basic system information. So it's /API/ping, and at which point we're passing the token utilizing authorization via bearer token. So that's really the script in itself. So we'll go ahead and run it so we can see what it looks like. It's Python 3, 1 basic. All right, so let's take a quick look at the output. So the token response. So that was the full payload that was pulled back from the REST API. So as we see, there's access token, there's token type, refresh token, when it expires from a second standpoint, and then the scope. So as I said, what we want is the access token from this response payload. So what that will do is we access it via that access token method. And so in this case, we've also specified that we want to then utilize that token to authenticate to the Morpheus REST API for the ping operation. So we see that /API/ping returns a payload that includes success if true, as well as the build version of Morpheus that I happen to be running in this environment. So we've authenticated to the Morpheus REST API utilizing username and password. If we had generated a token utilizing the Morpheus API, we would need to use this REST token function. We would just simply specify token equals whatever it is that we saw. Certainly, we could specify that as an environment variable or a number of different ways that we could securely handle that access token, similar to ways in which we could handle the username and password for this particular code. Certainly, that can be done, but we've walked through basic example of leveraging and interacting with the Morpheus REST API. So let's take a look at another example. Commonly, when you talk about REST APIs, we're talking about CRUD operations, which is essentially create, read, update, or delete operations against a given object via the REST API. So as an example, we want to see about creating a group within the Morpheus platform. We also want to read that group that we've just created. We want to update properties about that group that we just created. And then finally, we're going to delete the group that we just created. Certainly, the list of operations isn't particularly useful altogether for what we're doing, unless we're doing some sort of testing. But to showcase all the various capabilities, we're going to run through all those different operations. And so one of the things that we see also here on this slide is, in this case, create is a post operation to the API endpoint, a read is a get, an update is a put, and finally, a delete happens to be a delete. So let's take a look at another code example for interacting with the Morpheus REST API. So let's go ahead and clear our terminal. Let's come down to various operations. So we'll come to the main function and we'll take a look. So we saw the fetching of the token and those things. We're not going to go over those again, but we have things like create group, which in this case accepts a URL, a token, the name of the group, the code, and the location. So in this case, we're simply specifying the various parameters that need to be configured for this object. And then once that's done, we're going to fetch the group that we just created. So we're storing the group information in terms of the response in the payload. And then we're utilizing that again by accessing group and then ID to read that group. Then we're going to update the group. In this case, we're simply changing the location from Colorado to Dallas. And then finally, we're going to delete the group. All right, so let's take a quick look at some of these API endpoints. In this case, it's API/API/groups in addition to the base of the URL. The payload, in this case, is group and includes various different parameters, name, code, location that will specify. And then send the post operation to this particular API endpoint to create a group within the Morpheus platform. Fetch group, very similar. from a code perspective to the creation of the group, except we're not passing any parameters because we're doing a get operation. Essentially, we're reading that, but what we are doing is we're modifying the URL to include the ID of the group that we want to fetch. So in this case, /API/groups, and then /ID is what we want to be able to leverage. Updating the group is essentially a mix of the create and the read that we saw. So we're going to specify the specific group by its ID, passing that in the URL, but then we're also specifying a payload that we want to pass, which includes the location. So that's where we took a look at updating location from Colorado to Dallas. So we're going to utilize the update capability to be able to update the location in the platform. And then finally, deleting the group. So we're going to once again specify the specific group by its ID in the URL to then delete that group from the Morpheus platform. So let's take a look at the execution of this script. All right, so there's some additional details that we took a look at from a print perspective. So we can see that this is the create operation, and it spits out the actual group object from its JSON payload. So we see the group, we see the ID of this particular group is 28. We see that we specified the name, the code, the location as part of this particular workload. So there's a number of pieces of metadata that are also provided for us as part of this process. One of the other things we have here is success equals true. So in this case, that let us know that our API operation was successful in terms of creating the group. Could return an error that would let us know that, hey, something didn't go quite right. It could be something along the lines of letting us know that maybe there was a name that already existed with that, a group that already existed with that name. Maybe that's why it failed. Number of various different reasons, but that is in this case, the indicator that let us know that our operation was successful. Read operation. So we see that this payload is essentially the same payload, except for that success component. It's because essentially it is. So when we created the group, it provided us with the group object, and now we're simply reading that same grouped object again. Update response. So in this case, we updated the location. We changed it from Colorado to Dallas. We can see that as indicated by the location, which is now Dallas instead of Colorado, because that's what we updated as part of our update operation. And then finally, the delete. So we see that the delete has a success of true, which lets us know that the group that we created, read, updated, has now been deleted from the Morpheus platform. And so in theory, if we were to go to run this again, we should see that the group ID for our new group would increment to the next available number, which would be 29 as part of the process. So that would let us know, hey, the group that we created is actually deleted, and now it's going to increment that number as part of the process. All right, we've taken a look at authenticating to the Morpheus REST API, performing basic CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete against the Morpheus REST API. So let's continue to take a look at some more complex examples to better understand how we can interact with the Morpheus REST API. Morpheus platform does include a number of objects or items in the platform that might include potentially tens, hundreds, or even thousands of that given object. Some examples could be things like plans and prices, or instance layouts, or virtual images. One of the things to understand with the Morpheus REST API is the ability to be able to paginate, or from a UI perspective, it's commonly thought of as going to the next page. So you get to the bottom of the table and you say, I want to go to page 2 or page 3, page 4. That's essentially what we're doing, because when we interact with the Morpheus REST API for various objects to fetch objects like virtual images or those various objects, we're going to be presented with some metadata. The reason for the metadata is because commonly the call that we make may or may not include all the responses or all the objects in a single response. So as an example, if I have, let's say, 300 virtual images in my environment. The API call that I make may only return the first 50 objects or virtual images. And I want all of the virtual images, not just the first 50. How do I iterate or page through all 300 of those objects to be able to pull back that information? So certainly a number of things to also mention or caveat here is that the Morpheus REST API for various Git operations does include the ability to be able to filter on various pieces of metadata. So let's say pulling back 10,000 automation tasks may not be the most efficient thing to do if you only want 2 of those automation tasks. It's a good chance there may be something that could be leveraged, let's say maybe like a label in newer versions of the Morpheus platform to filter on, or even potentially a name or certain things to which you're not be expecting to pull back 10,000 automation tasks. But let's say there is a scenario where you do need to pull back all of the records or all of the objects for that given type. That's where the response metadata comes in handy. There's a number of pieces of information in the metadata that will provide you a way to be able to iterate through all of the objects to pull those back in a response payload or multiple responses. So there's the metadata that includes max, offset, size, and total. So we're going to go through what each of those means. So we're actually going to start with total and then sort of work our way up. So total is the total number of objects for that given type that Morpheus has in the database. So as an example that we see here, there are 100 total objects. So in this case, it could be virtual images. So in the database, there are 100 virtual images. Size is the number of responses or objects included in this particular API call. So if I call it the API, in this case, it returned 50 objects or 50 virtual images in this particular API call. Offset is a mechanism to move to essentially a new page, as an example. So oftentimes, if you have, following along with this example, if my first page includes 50 results, I now need to change the offset on my subsequent API call to move it to the next page, which is past those 50 objects that were returned in the initial result. So in this case, I would change it to 50. My offset in my next API call is to get my next set of objects, because I returned 50, which is 0 through 49. So now I want to go to that 50th object and start from there, technically the 51st object from a total count perspective. And max is the maximum number of objects that will be returned in my API call. So in this case, in order to get all 100 objects, I would need to make 2 API calls. The max can be still set at 50. The size will be 50 for both, as an example, and I'll touch on when that could change. And the total would still be the same because there's still 100 objects in the database. The thing that I would change is the offset to be able to accommodate my second call, grabbing the last 50 objects. Question then becomes, when will size be something different? So as an example, if I were to have 99 objects in the database, virtual images in the Morpheus database, my first API call would be max of 50, offset of 0, size of 50, because the first 50 objects would be returned. When I go to interact with the system for that second API call, the size is going to change because the offset of 50 is going to get that second half of objects, but because my total is only 99, the size is going to be 49 because that's what's being pulled back in that call, is the last 49 objects as part of that. So we're going to delve into some code and walk through what that looks like. Let's take a look at some API calls. So as an example, I could iterate or hit API library layouts to pull back instance layouts. I'm gonna reference the metadata to look at the number of returned items. I'm going to make a subsequent call, following along in our example, to include a query parameter of offset equals 50 because I want to get the next set of objects to align with what I pulled back in the first payload. Then once again, I'm going to get another set of returned items as part of that process. So let's take a quick look at some code to be able to see that process. So once again, we got our fetch token that we're not concerned about. Let's take a look at our main example. So fetching the token, we've got the token, that's all good. And what I've actually done is I wanted to pull back all of the instance layouts for this particular environment in a single API call. So got a question. What happens if the data updates between two pagination requests? So that's a good question. So ultimately what will happen if it is actually that quick is that you won't get that data depending upon where it lands in the API call, because that's just simply a mechanism of how the data works, in that if I've made that call, similar to if it was a single API call, if as I was making that API call, the data was updating on the back end in some essentially quote unquote race condition, then I'm not going to get that API call. So certainly it's one of the things to be mindful of in terms of how long your API calls take in terms of how much pagination you want to do. So we'll take a look at that specific thing in a second when I run this, because it is going to take a little bit of time because I'm pulling back all of that data as part of the API call. So hopefully that answers the question. Surely something to be aware of, race conditions and data consistency, if that is a hard requirement for something that in particular that you're working on as part of a process. All right, so we have a function of list all instance types. So let's take a look at our list all instance types. So we're going to take a look at the get instance layouts first, and then we'll come back because I want us to see what those API calls look like. So for our get instance layout or instance layouts, it's similar to the other API calls that we had, except that we're passing now a payload of max, which is our maximum items returned in the single API call, as well as an offset. We talked about the offset essentially being that moving to the next page or next set of items returned as part of the process. This particular function, I have a default max items of 25, default offset of 0. Certainly those can be overridden, which I actually will in some of my requests. So what we want to do is we want to hit that API endpoint as part of the process. So in this case, I'm actually overriding those max items. So right now, our max items that we're going to return in a single API call are 200. The offset that we're going to start with is 0. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the first 200 instance layouts in the Morpheus platform. So we see a number of the things that we talked about, size and total in particular. Those are important pieces of metadata that we need to grab in order to be able to iterate over all of the items in the REST API. So we're going to see how many we pull back, and then we're going to see the total. So let's take a look. So for instance layout, so one of the things that I wanted to do in this example, doesn't have to be what you do, is what I wanted was a single payload that looked like the instance layout that is returned via the Morpheus REST API, but just includes all of the objects. So what I'm doing is I am actually breaking apart the response payload that includes the metadata and the objects, and then essentially rewrapping that with all of the objects in a single payload. Certainly you could just make the multiple API calls and iterate through those responses as they come in. I just, as an example, wanted all of them in a single payload. So one JSON object that included all of the instance layouts in my environment, but was created as part of multiple API calls. So in this case, I've got the response payload from the initial call, which includes those 200 items. So give me that object. And I've actually done is I've created the new JSON payload up here. So essentially, I'm mimicking the single REST API call, as I said, but combining all of them together. So I'm adding the initial API call, those instances or those instance layouts to my JSON payload. So what we're going to also do is we're going to iterate through, based upon the information we pull back, the total. So we got the total. So following along on our example from previously, for simplicity, we had those 100 items. So what we're doing is we're trying to figure out how many pages that we have. So we're dividing the total number of objects by the maximum number of objects that we're going to return in a single pool. So in the case of our example, at 100 total objects, we're pulling 50 objects at a time. So do the math. That's going to give us 2 pages. We need to make 2 API calls as part of that process. So our current page is the first page. And so one of the things that we want to do is the math might not be a whole number. So as an example, if we had something like 112 divided by our 25 of max items, as an example, that's not going to give us a whole number. So what we've done with this math.ceil or ceiling is I want to round up. Give me the next number up. So if, let's say as an example, the pages were to equal 2.5. Instead of 2.5, I just want 3. So I need to make 3 API calls to return all of the objects for this particular scenario. And so as long as the current page is less than that number, I'm going to keep iterating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, as an example, multiply my max items times my current page. And so current page is 1 right now. So we, once again, going back to our example of 150, 100 total objects, 50 items pulled back. When I'm on the iterating through the process of the first page, I'm going to pull back the next 50. So I want to set my offset to the next group of items. So the next group of 50. That's essentially what I'm doing, is going through the next sets of whatever it ends up being. So as an example, if there were 200 items and we're only pulling back 50, once I get to page 3, my offset is going to be at 150. So that's the process that's going on here. So that's what we see is we're once again making that get instance layouts API call. We're specifying the max items, which is still what we specified initially, but we're changing that offset to be essentially the next group or set of items. Then once again, iterating through that response payload to create a larger object and then incrementing our current page. So there's a number of moving pieces there, but really what we're doing is, you think of it logically, we're chunking up the API calls and just moving from the first group to the second group to the third group to the fourth group to the fifth group on until we get all of the objects for that particular API endpoint. So let's run our item. So as I said, this is actually going to take a little while. So dependent upon the object types that are being pulled back and the number of items, it could take a little while to iterate through all of those objects, which is why there's a number of things to consider before you want to say, you know what, give me all 30,000 of these or 15,000 of those. Probably makes more sense to figure out what can I do to be more specific about what I'm pulling back from that payload. So as we see here, we're pulling back all of these particular objects. And so for what I did was, as I said, I bundled everything into a single payload, which is what I did with the break apart individual API calls, put them all back together in a single JSON payload, which includes things that mimic the Morpheus response payload for a single call. So we have the max of 100, in this case, size and total of 514. So those are the total number of instance layouts in my particular install of Morpheus. And so we didn't do that, or we didn't pull all of those back in a single API call, because we saw when we hit the Morpheus REST API for our even our initial payload, it was only 200. So we only grabbed the first 200, but in this particular case, it's got the 514 that we pulled back. So certainly can be done. to iterate through all of those. Once again, do want to caveat that make sure that it's a good example or a good use case for pulling back all of those items in a single response, essentially. All right, so let's go to keep iterating through some examples. We've got 2 more examples, try to get through these. In addition to pagination, one of the other caveats or things that are a little different from an operational standpoint with the Morpheus REST API for given operations is essentially execution of things like automation tasks. So as an example, I might want to trigger the execution of a shell script against an instance in my environment for patching or just a routine security task, whatever it might be. So I want to make that call. From a Morpheus REST API standpoint, how that works is I trigger the execution of that task against the workload. And what it returns is a job execution ID. So it doesn't return the response payload that includes all of the information about the particular automation execution or those details. What it does essentially responds with a pointer to that information. So I need to take that pointer and then make another REST or subsequent REST API calls to find the information from an API standpoint. So in this case, we had API task /ID, which is the ID of the task that I want to execute. Then execute is going to accept a payload that includes data about things like what instance I want to run that against, as well as various parameters for that automation task. It's going to return the job execution ID, and I'm going to then use that job execution ID to fetch information from the API /API/job-executions/ the ID of the execution that it gave me to then return the job execution status. So commonly what you might leverage is that initial call to trigger the execution of the automation. And then subsequently, I'm going to keep polling for the status of that job execution until it has reached a status of completion. In this case, completion for that particular execution could be something like a failure, could be a success, could be an error. That would be the actual task or job execution being completed, whether it was success or failure. So let's take a look at an example of that. So let's minimize our fetch token. Let's clear our terminal payload. All right, so let's take a look at what we're doing here. So we have the token. We've already done that. We want to run our task. So in this case, we're going to hit that API endpoint that executes the automation. So run task. In this case, I'm specifying that it runs against a particular instance. Target type of instance could be target type of label, instance label, server label, various different pieces of data that can be passed to trigger the execution. In this case, we're utilizing the base URL /API/task, task ID, and then execute. We're going to return that JSON payload that the Morpheus REST API returns. So once we've got that, we're going to then utilize that job execution ID and set that as an execution ID. So that's going to be used for us to be able to poll or interact with the Morpheus REST API to determine when our automation task has successfully completed. So we got the wait execution. So this one includes some other things included. I won't delve too deep into these, but what we want to do is we want to set our initial status to something that we can iterate over. What we've added in some polling intervals as well as timeout to be able to specify, okay, how long should we keep checking the Morpheus REST API, as well as how frequently we should hit the REST API to give us an update on the status. So what we're doing is we're passing in the ID that we got from that job execution, and then we're simply hitting the API point of the get job execution, which is the API/job-executions, to get the current status for our particular job execution. We're going to sleep for a given interval in this particular case. And then we're going to do some iteration to be able to determine has our execution timed out. So it has the number of seconds that we specified that is the maximum amount of time that we're going to run or check this particular automation. Has it passed? And then if it has, we're going to say the execution is timed out. So what we're going to do is we're going to run the script and see the execution of this particular automation. All right, so we got our initial task response, which includes information about things like the job and the job ID. We set our current status to queued, so the job is being queued to be run by the Morpheus platform. So what's going to happen is we're going to wait, in this case, 15 seconds, and then we're going to see. So we see that the status has now changed to running from our queued as it goes through that process. So in this particular example, it is a very basic bash script that is sleeping, I believe, for 30 seconds, and then simply echoing out input or echoing out a test message. But it provides us a mechanism to see that we are polling and waiting for the completion of this particular automation task. So now we see the status has now changed to success. So what we're going to do is our script is actually going to wait for technically a little longer than it should. So that's simply just logic that I can change and update to say, okay, once that actual status is reached, don't wait any longer. But what we do see is that the script has exited because the status was no longer queued or running. It eventually changed to the completed or the success. So we get the payload response for our job execution. So the status changed to success. And in this case, we get additional information about what we actually did. So in particular, one of the things to be aware of in this example is our events. So in particular, we had output. So the script echoed testing. As our example, we could see additional data like duration, start time, all those things. But that's the mechanism by which to interact with the REST API for operations such as automation tasks, where it provides us with an ID that we then have to go and query. All right, last example as we get close to wrapping up, ordering catalog items within the Morpheus platform. So we've built up from things like basic authentication to CRUD operations to pagination of the REST API and objects. Took a look at the automation. And so the ordering of catalog items is very similar to what we just did, certainly a little more complex. Not going to go through everything in detail, but certainly do want to give a more robust example. So walk you through the Morpheus API/API/catalog/orders. We're going to hit that endpoint to order our catalog item. That would be similar to a user going into the Morpheus self-service catalog, filling in the information, requesting and clicking order for it to go through that process. It's going to return the payload, and then we're then going to use the information returned in that initial call to continue to poll the REST API for the status of that particular catalog item. So as I said, similar in many ways to what we saw from the automation example, but does include some additional caveats specific to ordering of catalog items. All right, so let's take a look at this. There's a lot of moving parts for this one, so I'll try to break them down as well as possible. So ordering of the catalog items. Order catalog item, we're passing URL, the token, in this case, the name of the catalog item, which happens to be API demo. So order catalog item. So specifying our authentication information, we're specifying details or information about the catalog item, in particular, the name. For this example, I don't have any inputs for this catalog item for simplicity, but those would go in config, can be found in the API documentation as part of the process. But what I want to do is I want to order a single item, which is why we see in my JSON payload, I have order items, and then I'm adding the single catalog item. Technically, it could be multiple items, but I just want the one item that's ordered as part of the process. We're going to specify API catalog orders. I'm going to pass that to the payload. And then what I'm actually doing in this one is I'm actually decomposing that a little bit, because in this case, I know it's exactly one item that has been ordered. And so I'm pulling out the ID specifically instead of just the full JSON response, because I only want the item ID for the first item in the order, because I know there's only going to be one item in any of the orders I make via this process. certainly something that you have to be aware of if you intend to order multiple items in a single order request. So we've now got the ID similar to as we got the execution ID for the job. We're going to pull that back to print that out. One of the things to caveat for the order of catalog items is that what I'm actually doing is I'm sleeping for 15 seconds. So for those that have ordered items, catalog items in the Morpheus platform, there is a couple of seconds in which you click the order button and the system goes away and processes that item. So if you immediately hit the next API call, you're not going to return any response. So I'm sleeping for 15 seconds. Could be 5 seconds, could be 10 seconds. I just happen to go with something simple, straightforward, 15 seconds, sleep. Then after that's done, I'm going to get the catalog item. So we ordered the item. Now I want to start getting information about the catalog item. So we had the order, we had the item. So I want to get catalog item as part of the information I pull back. So let's take a look at get catalog items. That's simply API catalog / items. Give me the item and then go through that process. So part of that request, what I want to do is I want to get the item details for that given request. And then I'm going to pass, in this case, information about the item that was requested to the order details. Poll order status is our function. Let's take a look. So in this case, I'm going to order a single instance. Certainly, if you order a workload or an app, it's going to be slightly different in some ways. So certainly something to be aware of. But for this particular workload, I've got a status of provisioning. We're going to check if the status is still provisioning or pending. Pending in this case is for approval workflows, approvals. So if the instance has an approval associated, it will insert a status of pending. So I'm going to wait for that to complete. I'm going to get the catalog item that we specified to pull back that information. And then in this case, as I said, single instance, I'm going to get the status of the single instance. So if you have more complex catalog items that include multiple objects, certainly that would be something that you would have to accommodate for the status of those individual objects. Because as an example, if I had 2 instances in the catalog item, the first one might be successful, the second one might fail, or they both might be successful and the timing is just off. Maybe the second one is a SQL server. It takes 10 more minutes to complete. So going through that process, iterating through it to just make sure it's up and ready to go. And then finally, after everything is done, what I want to do is actually want to interrogate that payload and get the details, which is once again, we see single instance. I'm anticipating there's only one instance in this particular catalog item. Going to get the IP and external host name as part of that process. Let's kick off this item as we get close to the top of the hour. As this runs, definitely appreciate everyone hanging on and walking through these particular items. So we see the initial order response, which includes information about what we requested. We see that there's instance, is the type. So we requested an instance, and as part of that process, it's named API demo 2. So once again, there's an expectation of a certain structure because I'm ordering just a single instance as part of this process. See that the item was ordered. And so as part of the polling process, it's grabbing the status. So status is here for this particular instance, the single instance. As I said, if you have multiple instances as part of the process, you probably going to want to code to check the status of all the instances or another mechanism as part of that process. So it's running through the provisioning process. It's continuing to wait. It's continuing to poll. But what it's going to do after it has reached the success status is it's then going to go and grab those details about the particular instance. As I said, the IP address and external host name could be any additional details that I wanted to grab as part of the process. But those are the 2 that I wanted to grab out for this particular example. All right, so I don't think we're going to let this one reach completion because it's going to take a few minutes. But as I said, it's going to keep going through that process. And then the payload that is going to return after success is just going to give us the IP address and external host name. All right, so definitely appreciate the time and everybody jumping in and joining in. Certainly, if there are any other questions, the community forum is a great place to ask those questions. A number of people from the community are involved there and can help answer, as well as those of us that work at Morpheus to be able to answer those questions. So discuss.morpheusdata.com is a great place. Thank you all for joining.